You are standing in the middle of nothing, not the romantic kind of nothing that paintings show, where the sky meets the sand in a perfect golden line and a lone traveler rides a camel towards some ancient promise. This is the real Egyptian desert, the kind that kills without drama, without ceremony, and without warning. The sun is already past its peak, but it still hits your skin like an open flame pressed directly against your face. The sand under your feet has been baking since before sunrise, and even through whatever you're wearing, you can feel the heat radiating upward, working its way into your bones from below, while the sky attacks you from above. You have no water, you have no map, you have no compass, no shelter, no food, and no idea which direction leads to something living. What you do have, the only thing between you and the desert, is a single piece of linen. And what you do with it in the next few hours will decide whether you survive or become another set of bones slowly swallowed by the sand. Most people would use it wrong. Almost everyone would. The Egyptian desert is not a place that tolerates ignorance, and it never has. For thousands of years, this landscape killed people who underestimated it. Not just strangers, not just invaders, but locals, soldiers, priests, scribes, and merchants who had spent their whole lives living beside it. The ancient Egyptians did not romanticize the desert. They feared it. They called it Deshret, the Red Land, and in their cosmology it was the domain of Set, god of chaos, disorder, and violence. The fertile strip of land along the Nile was life. Everything beyond that narrow green corridor was considered a different reality entirely, a place where normal rules stopped applying and death became the dominant force. They were right. The desert did not care that you were educated, wealthy, or blessed by any particular god. It simply waited. So here you are, in a place ancient Egyptians considered the geography of death, holding a strip of linen. The first instinct most modern people would have is to wrap it around their shoulders or drape it over their head like a cape. That instinct is partially correct, but critically incomplete. The linen does what your skin cannot. It slows the movement of heat, reflects a portion of the light, and traps a thin layer of air between the fabric and your body. But if you leave any part of your head, your neck, or your face exposed, that protection becomes almost meaningless. The sun does not burn you evenly. It targets the top of your skull, the back of your neck, and the surface of your eyes with disproportionate intensity. Within 30 minutes of direct exposure at peak desert temperature, the body begins redirecting blood from internal organs toward the skin in a desperate attempt to cool itself. When that cooling mechanism starts failing, you don't just feel hot, you begin to lose judgment. That loss of judgment is the real killer. Not the temperature alone, not the dehydration alone, but the specific way the brain begins to malfunction under heat stress. Ancient Egyptian soldiers who served in desert campaigns sometimes reported seeing things, making decisions that made no logical sense, wandering off the trail for reasons they later could not explain. What those men were experiencing was the early stage of heat stroke, a condition where the internal body temperature climbs past the point the brain can sustain normal function. You begin to feel, paradoxically, less hot. The discomfort fades. You feel a strange calm, almost dreamlike, and then you start walking in the wrong direction because the body has stopped being able to tell the difference between the right choice and the fatal one. Your linen, used correctly, buys you time against that process. Wrap it fully around your head and neck, leaving only a narrow slit for your eyes. Pull it tight enough to stay in place, but loose enough to allow the faint movement of air. The white or pale color of ancient Egyptian linen, the kind woven from flax grown along the Nile, was not a coincidence of aesthetics. It was a survival decision encoded into culture over centuries of watching people die in the heat. Darker fabric absorbs solar radiation. Lighter fabric reflects it. The Egyptians understood this not in scientific terminology, but in the language of survival. You wore light colors, or you suffered more than you needed to. The next thing the desert takes from you after your clarity of thought is your moisture. The human body in extreme heat can lose between 1 and 2 liters of sweat per hour. You are not sweating in the heroic movie sense of glistening drops on a noble face. You are sweating in the brutal physiological sense. Your body is converting its internal water reserves into a cooling mechanism and releasing them through every pore. And it will continue doing this whether or not you have any water to replace what is lost. Think about the last time you were mildly thirsty, that faint pressure in the back of your throat, you satisfied by walking to the kitchen. Now imagine that sensation beginning to build and never being answered. Within 2 hours in direct desert sun, a person without water begins to feel the effects of dehydration in a way that is difficult to describe without having experienced it. The mouth stops producing saliva. Swallowing becomes uncomfortable. The eyes begin to dry against their lids. The skin, when pressed, stops snapping back to its normal position as quickly as it should. If you find shade, even partial shade, your situation changes significantly. The temperature difference between direct sunlight and shade in the Egyptian desert can exceed 15 degrees Celsius. That gap is not comfort. It is survival mathematics. In shade, your body's cooling demand drops, sweat loss slows, and the internal systems that were burning through your reserves begin to work at a more sustainable rate. The linen can create shade where none exists. Stretched between 2 objects, even 2 sticks if you can find them, or held up on one side by your own arm if you cannot, it becomes a roof. Thin and imperfect, yes, but enough to change the equation. The ancient Egyptians knew this. Desert caravans, military expeditions, and the workers who built the quarries in the eastern and western deserts all traveled with cloth, not as luggage, as equipment, as survival infrastructure. Papyrus records from the Middle Kingdom describe the careful allocation of linen to workers sent into the desert, alongside water rations, bread, and beer. The linen was not a luxury. It was listed alongside food and water as a basic necessity for keeping a person functional in that environment. Those bureaucrats managing supply lists were not being poetic. They were being precise. They understood that without fabric to manage the sun, workers died faster and the project suffered. The direction you walk, if you decide to walk, matters more than almost anything else. In the Egyptian desert, the Nile runs roughly north to south. If you are lost east or west of that river corridor, your goal is simple in theory and brutal in practice. Find the river or find a road that leads to it. In the ancient world, roads through the desert were not paved. They were tracks, worn into the sand by repeated passage of feet and hooves, often marked by small stone cairns or by the bleached bones of animals who did not survive the crossing. If you see a line of such markers in the distance, that is a road. Follow it. If you see birds circling, that often indicates either a water source or something dead, and in a desert context, both are worth investigating. Walking during daylight in peak heat, however, is a way to accelerate your own death. The ancient Egyptians moved through the desert primarily at night during hot seasons. Not because night travel was pleasant, it was not. The temperature could drop sharply enough to make cold a genuine concern. The stars were disorienting without training to read them, and desert animals that preferred to avoid humans during the day became more active in the dark. They moved at night because the arithmetic was simple. Every hour walked under the midday sun cost the body something it could not get back without water. Every hour spent still and sheltered, even uncomfortably, was an hour of survival extended. Your linen at night becomes a different tool. The desert loses heat rapidly after sunset, and a person who was desperate for cooling 6 hours earlier can be shivering by midnight. Linen is not wool. It does not insulate the way a heavy blanket would. But wrapped tightly around the body, it traps enough residual warmth to prevent the kind of dangerous cold that could cause muscle cramping, disorientation, and in extreme cases, hypothermia. The same fabric that saved you from heat during the day becomes the thing that keeps you from freezing at night. This was not lost on the Egyptians. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the village housing the craftsmen who built the Valley of the King's Tombs, lived adjacent to desert terrain and were documented receiving linen rations tied directly to seasonal need. Summer allocations, winter allocations, different quantities for different conditions, all tracked with the same bureaucratic precision that governed grain and oil. By the time night falls and you are still alive, you have already survived something that would have ended most modern people within the first 3 hours. Not because they were weak, but because they did not know what you now know. They would have panicked. They would have walked when they should have stayed still. They would have exposed their skin when they should have covered it. They would have used the linen as a gesture rather than as a system. Survival in the Egyptian desert was never about strength. It was always about knowledge, about understanding the invisible rules of a place that had been killing unprepared people for thousands of years before you arrived. There is a particular kind of silence in the desert at night that no one who has not experienced it can fully imagine. The wind drops. The sand stops moving. The temperature falls in a way that feels almost personal, as if the desert has decided to try a different method of killing you after the sun failed to finish the job. And in that silence, lying wrapped in your linen, watching the stars that ancient Egyptian navigators used to cross these same routes long before any modern instrument existed, you begin to understand something that no museum exhibit, no documentary, and no history class could have told you. This was not a civilization built despite the desert. It was a civilization built in direct conversation with it, shaped by it, defined by it, and terrified of it in ways that their art and mythology tried constantly to process. The linen wrapped around you right now is the same material they wrapped around their dead, not as irony, not as coincidence, but because it was the most available, most tested, most trusted textile in that culture. It preserved the body. It protected the body. It honored the body. And in the desert, in this moment, it is keeping your body alive through the same fundamental mechanisms it used for 3,000 years of recorded history. Think about the morning routine you will have when you get home. You will turn a handle and cold, clean water will fall into your palm. You will step into a shower and the temperature will be exactly what you want. You will dry yourself with a towel without thinking about what that towel represents in the physics of heat and moisture. You will apply deodorant, wear clothes made with industrial precision, eat food that has never touched sand, drink water that has never had to be rationed, and breathe air that smells of nothing in particular. Every single one of those moments will be separated from this one by a distance that no airplane ticket can measure. You are not just separated from the Egyptian desert by geography or by time. You are separated from it by a depth of suffering and knowledge that your daily life has never asked you to understand. Now think about what you are holding, a single piece of linen, and understand that it is not a primitive tool. It is the accumulated answer to a question this desert has been asking for millennia. The question is simply this: do you know enough to survive here? Most people, if they are being honest with themselves, do not. And that has always been the desert's truest secret, that the line between civilization and death was never a wall, never an army, never a technology. It was always a piece of fabric held correctly in the right moment by someone who understood what the desert was really asking. If there is a historical place, an ancient civilization, a forgotten ritual, or a buried daily reality that you think deserves this same kind of treatment, where the comfortable version gets stripped away and the raw truth underneath gets rebuilt without any of the glamour, drop it in the comments. The history you learned in school left out the most important parts. This channel exists to find them.